Faithful, we've got a great show today because we're tying together two topics that could not be more different but are equally fascinating heading into training camp season. First, we're going to talk about whether the 49ers should throw their hat into the ring for quarterback Brendan Sorsby in the NFL's upcoming supplemental draft, and whether a sixth-round pick is enough to secure what could be real long-term developmental value at the most important position in football. And then we're going to finish the job and count down the top 5 players on this entire 49ers roster right now, the elite tier, the players who make this team a championship contender year in and year out. Let's get into it. Let's start with Brendan Sorsby, the biggest name in this year's supplemental draft and honestly one of the stranger quarterback stories to come along in quite a while. Here's the quick background for anyone who needs a refresher. Sorsby transferred to Texas Tech this spring after a very successful run at Cincinnati, bringing with him $5 million in nil money and enormous expectations for what he was going to do with the Red Raiders this fall. Before he could play a snap, the situation surrounding his gambling history from his freshman year at Indiana caught up with him. We're talking about a documented pattern of placing bets on sports, including his own team while he was a college student, an issue the NCAA declared made him ineligible, with a Texas court briefly granting an injunction before the Big 12 pushed back hard enough that the legal landscape became untenable. Sorsby ultimately walked away from college football entirely and declared for the NFL's supplemental draft, which is expected to take place in mid-July. The supplemental draft is genuinely unusual and worth explaining clearly because not everyone knows how it works. It doesn't happen every year. In fact, the NFL hasn't had a player actually drafted in the supplemental process since 2019. And the draft itself hasn't taken place at all since 2023. This is a mechanism designed for edge cases, players whose eligibility status changes after the regular draft has already passed. Teams submit sealed bids offering a pick from the following year's draft, and the highest bidder wins the rights to that player. If multiple teams bid the same round, the tiebreaker goes to the order in the upcoming draft. The key wrinkle is that it's completely blind. You have no idea what anyone else is bidding, which means you need to make a decision entirely on your own assessment of how much the player is worth and what other teams might be willing to sacrifice. Sorsby checks a lot of the boxes you want from a developmental quarterback. He's 6'3" and around 234 pounds, so he has the size. His arm talent has drawn praise from evaluators who watched him at Cincinnati, and his dual threat ability is legitimate, with over 1,500 rushing yards and 22 rushing touchdowns across his college career, along with 59 touchdowns through the air on a 61% completion rate. The mechanical comparisons have been interesting too, with some scouts drawing parallels to Baker Mayfield for his aggressive, gunslinger mentality, and others pointing to his platform throwing ability as reminiscent of Aaron Rodgers, though with significantly rawer footwork that leads to accuracy inconsistency when he can't reset his base properly. He compares favorably to the Drew Allers and Cade Klubniks of this draft class, players who went in the 3rd and 4th rounds of this year's regular draft, which gives you a reasonable starting point for his supplemental valuation. Now here's the question for the 49ers specifically. Should they bid? And if they bid, how much is the right price? Let me make the case for a low bid. Mac Jones is almost certainly going to be released or traded after this season, which means San Francisco's backup quarterback room behind Brock Purdy is going to need some fresh answers by this time next year. Right now, because I don't believe in the football ability, but because the off-field situation requires real clarity from the NFL before any team should go that high. There are legitimate questions about what Sorsby's standing is under the league's personal conduct policy. Was his gambling history a first offense situation where he enters professional football with a clean slate? Or is he coming in already on some form of conditional status where one additional violation puts him at risk of permanent ineligibility. That distinction matters enormously for how you value him in a blind auction. If the league has given him a genuinely clean bill of health, go get him for a fifth or sixth. If his policy standing is genuinely uncertain, then the calculus changes significantly because you could be taking on a player whose NFL career could end before he ever plays a meaningful snap over something beyond the football. But assuming the policy situation is clear and the bid price is on the lower end of the spectrum, the 49ers have every reason to take a calculated swing on Sorsby. Kyle Shanahan has shown throughout his coaching career that he can develop quarterbacks who weren't considered slam dunk prospects. The system works. The reps would be meaningful. And even if Sorsby never becomes more than a quality backup in San Francisco, that's still a position of value on a roster that's going to need depth at that spot. Now let's get into the part of the show that wraps up a journey we've been on for a while, counting down the top 5 players on this entire 49ers roster. These are the players who define what this team is. The reason San Francisco has been in championship conversations year after year. The names whose absence or presence changes the whole picture of who this team can be. Let's count it down. Number 5, George Kittle. And honestly, ranking Kittle 5th is one of the more emotionally difficult things you can do as a 49ers fan. Because for most of his career in San Francisco, Kittle would have been number 1 on this list without much debate. He was the number 1 ranked player on this very roster last year before the season started. The problem is that 2025 was an incredibly difficult year for him physically, with a hamstring injury in Week 1 that kept him out for 5 games, an ankle issue in Week 16 that forced him to miss another game, and then the devastating news that hit in January when he tore his right Achilles in the wild card win over the Philadelphia Eagles. Kittle caught a 6-yard pass along the right sideline and went down, and the diagnosis confirmed what fans feared. A torn Achilles is a 9 to 12-month recovery under normal circumstances. Kittle's surgeon described his specific tear as a best-case scenario given where it occurred, closer to the muscle attachment point than the heel, which theoretically allows for a faster recovery. Kittle himself, who has never been accused of lacking confidence, told reporters he expected to be back well before November and that he wasn't closing the door on a Week 1 return. Whether that timeline holds is the great unknown of this 49ers season. Even if Kittle gets back on the field relatively early, there's a real question about whether he'll be the same devastating full-speed weapon he was when healthy, or whether the Achilles limits him in ways that don't show up in box scores but absolutely show up in performance. Regardless, when he is on the field and when he is healthy, Kittle is still an elite player, still a dominant run blocker, still a red zone nightmare, and still the emotional heartbeat of this offensive unit. Number 4, Nick Bosa. Trent Williams might be the best offensive lineman to ever play this game, or at minimum in the current generation of football. You can have the full-throated bias of a 49ers fan while saying that and still be in the range of reasonable football analysis. The case for Williams being a Hall of Fame lock is airtight. His 5th grades have been the best or near the best at his position for years running. His run blocking creates running lanes that coaches draw up in their sleep, but rarely see executed this cleanly in actual game conditions. His pass protection gives Brock Purdy the kind of time to operate that allows the entirety of this offense's concept tree to work as designed. He had a somewhat uneven early portion of the 2025 season while managing some knee soreness. But by the back half of the year, he was playing at his typical peak level, and he's now locked up through at least 2 more seasons. Trent Williams, at 36 years old, fully healthy and motivated, is still one of the 5 best players on either side of the ball in this entire NFL, and that's not a homer take. Number 2, Christian McCaffrey. The carry job that McCaffrey put in during 2025 was nothing short of extraordinary, and it's almost frustrating that it registered as a down year by the standards he's set for himself. He came within striking distance of 1,000 rushing yards and 1,000 receiving yards simultaneously, finishing close enough that in any other context that kind of production would be celebrated as exceptional. He was the Offensive Player of the Year runner-up. And crucially, he did it while carrying the offense essentially alone during the stretches when Brock Purdy was dealing with his own health issues. McCaffrey doesn't just accumulate yards, he makes everything around him work more efficiently. The run game threatens enough that it opens the passing game, which makes the play-action game functional, which creates the layered offensive attack that Kyle Shanahan has spent his career designing. One legitimate concern heading into this season is durability after a career-high workload, and it would be dishonest to pretend that's not a real risk. But even managing his touches smartly, even with Jordan Mason taking some of the load, an available and engaged Christian McCaffrey makes this offense genuinely dangerous in ways that almost no other player in football can replicate. And number one, Fred Warner. How could it be anyone else? Warner was the best linebacker in football through the first 2 months of last season. By all accounts, he was building toward a legitimate Defensive Player of the Year campaign before the injury intervened, and even Myles Garrett breaking the all-time sack record was probably the only realistic competition he would have faced for that award in the final accounting. The fact that Warner was playing at that level while the rest of this defense was battling injury after injury around him speaks to how dominant he was on a week-to-week basis. And the agonizing what-if of that playoff run, with Warner coming so close to returning in time for the divisional round against the Seahawks before ultimately being held out, is going to stay with 49ers fans for a long time. If Warner had been on that field, San Francisco might have had a real shot at a different outcome. That's the kind of impact one player can have, and it's the most honest argument for why he deserves the top spot on this ranking. Fred Warner is the best player on this football team, the best linebacker in the NFL, and if he stays healthy through the 2026 season, he has a genuine chance to win the award he was robbed of last year. So there you have it, faithful, the full top 5, Fred Warner, Christian McCaffrey, Trent Williams, Nick Bosa, and George Kittle. The elite core that has made this franchise one of the most consistently dangerous teams in football over the past several years. And perhaps a new addition coming in the supplemental draft if John Lynch decides a 6th-round pick is a reasonable price for a talented young quarterback who needs an organization and a system to develop him properly. Let me know in the comments who you think is ranked too high, who you think is ranked too low, and whether you'd want the 49ers to throw a bid in on Brendan Sorsby before mid-July. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you when training camp gets rolling. Go Niners!